Hello, everyone. My name is Ken Rooney. I'm going to be facilitating this webinar today, the topic being transforming your healthcare ESG to spur target performance and meet stakeholder expectations. I just wanted to go over some logistics really quickly in regards to this program. We are being recorded, and so if you do have questions or comments, please put them via the chat, or we can have some interaction at the end. There is one CPE credit that's available for this live session. So to get that CPE, you need to participate for the duration of the webcast. And then there are 3 polling questions embedded within this presentation that you'll need to answer. And then at the end, within 2 weeks, you'll be receiving your CPE certificates for this program. And then also, just so you know, there's going to be a survey that's going to be forwarded to you after this webcast. Okay. So with that said, I'd like to introduce the panel to you. You're gonna hear them all speak individually. So I'm just going to take the liberty to introduce all of them to you, and then you'll hear them speak later. Our main presenter today is going to be Augustine Doe. He is in our healthcare practice and is the VP of Strategic Enterprise Risk Management and is an ESG leader. We also have Ian Burnett, who represents our risk and compliance part of our GP, Jeff Farmer, who is in our supply chain organization, as well as Janis Parthun, who is a project management consulting services that is also looking at the accounting and reporting part of ESG. You'll hear them all speak later, but that's who will be presenting in today's webinar. So with that said, I'll hand it over to Augustine.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are joining us from today. For starters, this is a very important topic for us to dive into today. And what we're going to cover is we're going to start with just basically talking about what ESG means for any organization. That's one. The next, we're going to take a look at what companies get out of ESG. As you would probably well aware, shareholders hold companies responsible for a number of things. And that's one of the things that companies really focus on, is trying to achieve shareholder goals and making sure that it's in line with the company's strategy. So then 3, we're going to take a look at some of the areas of focus that providers and payers and life sciences really focus on when it comes to ESG. So when we take a look at that, we're going to highlight core areas that these providers or payers are really spending time to implement the ESG programs. And then we're going to move quickly to look at the ESG reporting and key drivers. This is where my colleague Janis is going to provide a high-level view of what it takes to report ESG and some of the key drivers of ESG. And then we're going to quickly touch on how you should align your ESG strategy to your enterprise strategy. Ian is going to be walking you through that process at a very high level. And Ian is also going to wrap up that conversation by touching on ethics and fraud in ESG. And then finally, we're going to have Jeff really dive into supply chain risk management and the impact ESG has on that supply chain risk management. And after that, we'll start taking your questions and hopefully answer all any questions that you have related to ESG. So let's dive in right away. Next slide, please. So when we talk about ESG and what it means for companies, fundamentally there are 3 pillars in ESG. We have the environmental pillar, the social, and the governance pillar. Now, it doesn't really matter what type of company you're operating. What we've noticed out there that generally companies, when they talk about the environment, they talk more about the greenhouse gas emissions, and then they usually spend some time on the waste and pollution, water use, and land use. Those generally are the areas that companies touch on when it comes to the environmental piece of ESG, the pillar of ESG. When you talk about the social part, there's conversation a lot centered around the workforce and the diversity of your workforce, the safety management piece of the business, customer engagement, and communities. how are you impacting those communities that the business resides or operates in? And then when you talk about the governance piece, which has really become front and center of every business discussion going forward, you talk about the structure of your oversight of the ESG program. And you talk about the codes and the various values that you generate as a result to really keep your ESG system moving forward. And then, of course, the transparency and the reporting part. And most importantly, the financial and the operational risks that come with ESG. Those are all addressed under the governance pillar. Next slide, please. So here is where we spend a lot of time to really get companies comfortable with ESG by talking about what they get out of ESG. And, the jury is still out, but the evidence so far is that, when you have a highly rated ESG rating, what usually means is that your valuation, the valuation of the company is much higher, and also you are much more profitable. This is research from Harvard Law School. They've been following companies that have high ESG rating and trying to figure out what are the type of benefits they're experiencing. And the surprising thing also was that when you have a highly rated ESG program, you actually are negatively correlated to volatility, meaning your business is less volatile, and therefore you are a lot more steady state business. You achieve your performance goals quite consistently. So that's one of the things that so far companies are experiencing by being highly rated ESG companies. Another is when you talk about a highly rated company, they are also experiencing good allocation of capital. Their capital is being maxed optimally used, and therefore they're really returning value to their shareholders. The third thing that they followed companies and are finding that highly rated ESG companies have in common is that their stocks outperform other stocks. So that's a big deal. And then the fourth one is when you're a highly rated ESG company, well, your business is less cyclical. And what that means is that you have, ongoing basis, you really achieve your performance goals on an ongoing basis, and therefore you are not subject to a lot of the changing environment of your business. So on the whole, you see that this all put together helps the organization really achieve any targeted performance they want to achieve. And therefore, ESG is a really good program to have to help you achieve your targeted performance. Let's go to the next slide, please.
So our first polling question, everybody, from the previous slide, what are the key, I'm going to actually launch the poll. What are the key benefits organizations are experiencing for implementing ESG? Positive valuation, higher margin stocks tend to outperform, they're less cyclical, all of the above. Yeah, perfect. Yes. It is all of the above. Good job, everyone.
Next slide, please. So as we promised earlier on, we're going to be talking a lot about healthcare organizations, and we're going to start with the provider and the payers. What areas are they highly focused on when it comes to implementing an ESG? As you can see there are three pillars in the ESG framework: the environmental, social, and the governance piece. Now, what we see out there in terms of focus for payers and providers is that they're focusing a lot more on, for instance, the advanced waste management practices. That's one when it comes to the environmental piece. And carbon neutrality is also in the background there, where they're trying to figure out or create a roadmap for achieving, the carbon neutrality goals in, then, say, 5 to 10 years. So that's something we are also seeing. Now, when we look at both the payer and the provider, the pillars that they really, really focus on has been the environmental piece and the governance piece. The governance piece, they're spending a lot more time really talking about ethics, compliance, and fraud policies. So my colleague Ian later on is going to provide a lot more insight on that. They're also talking about gender and racial diversity and how to really even the field in terms of workforce capacity. So there's also really the idea of spending a lot more time on how to put together really good responsibility reports that we communicate their efforts in the ESG implementation. Now, the social piece has not been, it's not as rigorous as the environmental and the governance piece. That's what we're seeing so far out there. Although they're spending a little bit more time on the supplier diversity program, part of the social pillar. Next slide, please.
Next polling question. What key ESG pillars are healthcare providers and payers focusing on when they implement ESG? Social and economic, environmental and governance, environmental and diversity, social and waste management. I'm going to re-present this slide while you answer this question. Didn't get a lot of people answering this, so let's spend a little bit of time. For healthcare providers and payers, where are they focusing? The answer is B, environmental and governance. Augustine, you want to speak a little bit more to the why they're focused there?
Well, so one of the things that we're noticing payers and providers focus on is that those things that are really uniquely important for the, administering patient safety, managing population health, and also making sure their loss ratios, medical loss ratios are where they need to be, especially when you talk about the payers. So that for them has meant that they have to find ways of really efficiently getting rid of being able to manage their waste, waste management practices in a way that allows them not just to save on cost, but also to look environmentally friendly. So that's one of the reasons why they focus a lot on the waste management practices. The other is the carbon neutrality part. They want to make sure that they are not contributing a lot of carbon to the environment. So that's why the environmental pillar has been an area that has been of great interest for them. Now, in order for you to really work your program or make sure your ESG is going according to your strategies or going according to your goals, you need to govern it. So the governance piece is almost like a no-brainer for them. They had to focus on the governance piece because that's where you can articulate what you're doing for the program. And therefore, they've spent a lot of time talking about the ethics, compliance, and the fraud policies. And they have appointed ESG leaders and really are focused on generating the appropriate reports that convey what it is that they are doing for the ESG program. Now, this is not to say the social piece is not being done. It just doesn't have the visibility of the environmental and the governance piece. Does that help explain?
Yep. Yes. Great. Thank you. So there's a question real quickly, and I think it got brought up because there's a point up here, and I don't know if it's Janis, you or Augie can respond to this. Is that I know ESG reporting is required for publicly traded companies. Is ESG reporting required for not-for-profit healthcare companies or state universities with medical centers?
I'll speak a little bit to that when it comes to my segment on the ESG reporting, and we can talk a little bit from a regulatory perspective and then more from a strategic perspective. Does that work?
Yeah, great, thanks. Okay.
So that said, let's move on to the next slide, which talks a lot more about the life sciences and the biopharma, which areas they're more focused on when it comes to an ESG program. What we are seeing out there is that they are a lot more focused on making sure the clinical trial practices are done right in a way that allows for diversity in their clinical trial practices. They also focus a lot on supply chain management, which my colleague Jeff is going to talk to later on during the webinar. We've also seen that risk and crisis management is front and center of their ESG program, because at the end of the day, ESG is about managing risk, and therefore you need to have a risk and crisis management program in place. Now, there are other things that they are doing where they're looking at the environmental impacts, the climate change, how it's impacting their business. But the focus has been a lot more on making sure that the clinical trials are being done in a diverse manner. Their supply chain is being managed effectively, and therefore they're able to deliver their promise to their customers. Next slide, please. Now, this is where I'm going to hand over to my colleague Janis, who is going to spend some time talking about the ESG reporting and also the key drivers of ESG. Janis, please take it from here.
Yes, great. Thank you for the audience for attending, and I'm glad to be here to just talk about ESG reporting, give you some background. So there are a lot of significant interest to report on ESG proponents. Can say that ESG may influence how they purchase and invest on the company. And then also companies want a way to share how they're acting responsibly with their employees, with their suppliers, with their customers, with their environments. And actually over 90% of the SP 500 voluntarily publish sustainability reports in some form or fashion. But then there's also critics such as ESG ratings that's been developed that ranks public companies on how they're performing on ESG factors, and it can create some frustration for some companies. And then the other question is the fund or the investment products labeled with ESG. So for healthcare and pharma companies, the social aspect of ESG has been a bit more inherent and part of the organization's mission for many, because focusing on the care of people and patients. And then although not all organizations share a similar strategy or approach in reporting in a structured way or with a program. So I like to first initially provide some brief background on ESG reporting and the reporting work streams associated first, and then talk about the drivers next. And that includes public and private companies as well. So now you can see here when companies are having to include ESG information in the financial statements, these are likely more regulatory driven. And then on the right, you can see beyond the financials, this reporting stream is more strategic in nature when companies are sharing ESG efforts in ESG or sustainability reports, or on their websites when they're providing information on that. Now, next slide. What I like to do first is discuss some of the recent regulatory drivers as these directly impact the financial statements. And I'd say, more so it does have a larger impact on the public companies, but I'll highlight some of that. And then from a regulatory and standard setting bodies perspective, they're also really been paying attention on how companies are reporting on ESG matters. Now, in terms of for public companies, the SEC has already required businesses to include human capital disclosures in the financials. But this year, the SEC also had proposed disclosure requirements specifically around climate risk, and to require public companies to disclose details within their filings. And so this is a significant part is having to align to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, as many may have heard already, disclosing on the governance, strategy, risk management, greenhouse emissions, and the targets. And then the companies will also need to consider the financial impact of possible climate-related events, and this includes disclosing financial impacts when calculating some cumulatively greater than 1% of a significant line item within the financials. And then also for greenhouse emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2, Scope 3 of material, obtaining a reasonable assurance for accelerated and large accelerated filer organizations. So I would say the elements that are most sensitive for public companies right now or are causing stirs are really the data collection and then the related efforts to meet the reasonable assurance requirements and estimating the financial impacts to possible climate-related events. We've also published a blog that would provide a little bit more detail under our RGP Insights if the audience is interested in learning a little bit more about that. Now, cybersecurity risk has been even more prevalent, and so the SEC issued a proposal to enhance disclosures around cybersecurity risk management and incident reporting by public companies, and specifically reporting material cybersecurity incidents within 4 business days of confirming. Now, moving on to the financial reporting and accounting standard perspective, which is applicable for all public, private, and nonprofits. This is the accounting for environmental credit programs. It's a new topic on the FASB's agenda to assess requirements for participants that's in the compliance and voluntary programs that lead to the creation of environmental credits. And there's been some diversity in the practice and not much direct guidance. And the credits may be part of the emissions trading, renewable energy credits, carbon offset credits. And the focus really is on the credits that are enforceable and traded. And although this is in the early deliberations, I really just want to bring this up for awareness because organizations are increasingly trying to engage ways to reduce carbon emissions, and credits is one way to do that. So now on the international front, the IFRS Foundation created the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, focused on sustainability-related disclosures to really help investors make more informed decisions about ESG matters. And there's 2 exposure drafts been out, general sustainability-related disclosures, which help sets out overall requirements, and then climate-related disclosures, which is really similarly built upon recommendations from the TCFD. Now, when these standards are officially issued, they're really not mandated unless the country or the jurisdictional authority decides that companies should comply. But then interesting enough, this shift really towards compliance is starting to happen internationally. So from a UK perspective, there are already 2 requirements. One is the streamlined energy and carbon reporting, which requires public companies to specifically disclose energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. And then the TCFD disclosure requirements, which includes public, private, and certain LLP companies that to incorporate TCFD aligned climate disclosures in their annual reports. And then from the EU perspective, there's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is adopting a new rule requiring all large companies to publish regular reports on ESG, and it's likely to be effective in 2024. So that's the regulatory drivers that I wanted to initially highlight, and there's been significant emphasis from a climate risk perspective. But stepping back, considering from a broader ESG reporting context, let's discuss the strategic drivers here. And as I mentioned before, 90% of the SP 500 already voluntarily published sustainability reports in some form or fashion. But what's driving this interest to report on ESG matters? So I guess first is having to have a more formal ESG program can really help set clear strategic goals and expectations that is recognizable by a broader audience and holds the management team and internal stakeholders more accountable. So whether you represent a provider or a payer or a pharmaceutical organization, just having structure to help you be able to better communicate ESG efforts and progress to the community. It could be the community, the donors, or the investors at large. And then interesting enough, ESG considerations are also increasingly being identified explicitly in credit rating methodologies as a component of hospital or health systems' wider performance, according to the Foundation of American College of Healthcare Executives. And as part of the wider global trend across all industries, the focus of environmental sustainability and healthcare is increasing, as Augustine mentioned earlier, although there's still focus on the social aspect of the ESG, such as supporting the underserved communities. So for example, in 2020, there are 8 big pharmaceutical companies had access and strategy to low and mid-income countries. But today, 17 out of the biggest 20 companies do, according to MarketLine. So it's really picking up in terms of focusing on the other aspects as well. But it's also important to understand and set your goals and targets specific to your industry. Now, there's certain topics that are really applicable and common across the industries, such as the climate change, diversity, inclusion, and then ethics and governance. And healthcare companies have been amplifying their commitments to sustainable operations by making more public statements about plans to reduce emissions and become net carbon neutral, according to Fitch Solutions. Now, it's important, though, to tailor and set your priorities and goals that have significant impact to your organization. So, for example, for providers and payers, this could be supporting the underserved communities to monitoring employee health and safety. And metrics may be having to establish and discuss the strategy to manage and support the mix of patient insurance status, to sharing the employee safety data, such as total recordable incident, to days away, restricted and transferred, or focusing on the supplier diversity, as mentioned earlier, and conduct a supplier social assessment and disclosing the number of participating suppliers. So for life sciences and pharma, this may be the safety of clinical trials to supply chain management and the production of the drugs, and having to have goals or at least describing and discussing by world region of the management process for ensuring the quality and the patient safety during clinical trials, and disclosing the number of FDA-sponsored inspections. Or quantifying the percentage of supplier facilities participating in audit programs and the goals to increase that percentage. So while you may already be communicating a number of these initiatives, having a structure and a framework be able to help communicate and convey these efforts and hold your organization more accountable. Investors, donors, and other stakeholders will also want to understand how organizations are holding themselves accountable, setting the metrics, and monitoring the progress and the performance. Now, there are multiple standards and frameworks that's been available for some time. I just want to highlight 2 key standards that companies tend to utilize for sustainability reporting, which I'll bring up, and it provides a common global language to communicate sustainability-related impacts. So you have the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, which is now part of the IFRS Foundation and ISSB oversight. And it's structured by industry profile and focused on financially material metrics. Now, a global reporting initiative, or GRI, is structured by specific topics, along with defined metrics. And then for climate-specific standards and frameworks, there are, I mentioned earlier, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which develops recommendations for information that companies should disclose to support the external stakeholders in assessing risk related to climate change. And then you have the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which provides the framework to measure and manage the emissions. And then you have been hearing quite a bit more lately is the Science-Based Target Initiative, which defines and promotes best practices in the emission reduction and net zero targets in line with climate science. Now, this is just a highlight of the ESG reporting landscape and the drivers to consider from regulatory perspectives to strategic, And now I'd like to pass over to my other colleagues to discuss other aspects of ESG.
Well, before we do that, we do have a polling. Do we have a poll?
Yeah, but actually, hold on a second. So just real quick, hey, Janis, just wanted to go back to the question that was in here. And I want to, it's that you talked about the reporting and understanding for publicly traded companies, especially life sciences companies that are publicly traded. But is ESG reporting required for not-for-profit healthcare companies or state universities with medical centers? And my thought was the answer is yes, because they have the one is that they are getting government funding, right? They may have bonds and they're not for profit, as well as they're getting some type of it's state universities are getting government funding. Therefore, I think it applies to them. Could you clarify, or am I wrong in thinking that way?
Yeah, I'll just clarify that in terms of, from a broader perspective, in terms of the regulatory requirement from SEC and things of that sort, that does tend to be focused more on public companies. But then that's correct that if you're receiving or seeking funds from other aspects, such as the government, you likely will have some aspects of reporting that they may be asking for. And so this is where I'm talking about from a donor perspective or from a funding perspective. And then also from a credit seeking perspective, as I mentioned, there's really been more trends of having to incorporate ESG factors in evaluating and assessing that. And so while it might not be necessarily a mandated aspect of things set by a certain, for public companies, there are luckily other aspects that that other drivers that you may have to be reporting on in order to receive the funding, or from a donor perspective, having to seek that information. Does that answer?
Yep, I think it does. So the answer is yes, high likelihood.
Yes.
Next polling question, everybody, in regards to the two primary drivers that you just heard Janis talking about, what are the two primary drivers of ESG? Regulatory and strategic, compliance and diversity, financial and risk mitigation, none of the above? Great. It is the first answer, regulatory and strategic for the two primary drivers of ESG.
Well, I think this is a good segue into the Ian part of the conversation, where Ian is going to talk a little bit about how ESG strategy must align with the corporate strategy, and and also share a little bit more light on ethics and fraud in ESG. Ian, please take it from here.
And actually, can I just before Ian, sorry, I just want to acknowledge it's 34 minutes into the hour. I just want to be mindful of time. Okay. And secondly, everybody, while you're listening to Ian, can you actually answer the question? I actually had a couple of people ask this in the Q&A. If you could put this in the Q&A, your answer is, where are you in your ESG journey? Like, not started but plan to, and then you need help, you're doing it all internally, you hired someone to do it externally. I'll share the answers with you at the end, but just curious, I should have put that polling question in together. But if you could respond during the rest of this, we can share the answer so all of you know where you're all sitting in different places. Where are you in your ESG journey? Not started, but plan to start, doing it internally. We've started internally, we've started it, we're going to hire someone, we're using someone externally. Thank you. Sorry, Ian, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Ken and Augie. Yeah, great content so far. So this is going to be, complementary to what we've heard before, and you'll see some overlap and some touch points for sure, but let's just build out a little bit more context here around, how do you think about this from a risk management and enterprise strategy perspective? And I would say that ESG is very broad. It touches a lot of different areas. If you kind of go through each of those three pillars and look at what is associated with those categories, we think of this as not that much different from what you would do in terms of overall enterprise risk management, right? It's a little bit different, but ESG risks you could think of as a subset of enterprise risks because it is quite pervasive. And so for that reason, I would say you very well could be further along than you think. If your organizations have any element or any structure or frameworks or protocols around doing aspects of enterprise risk management, you're going to be in a very good place to start your journey around ESG risk management because the principles are very similar. So by that I mean, you've got to define, what is your strategy as an organization as it pertains to ESG, and what do you need to be as an organization to kind of tackle this and address the risks. So you need to think about it in terms of, what will you be required to do from a regulatory and legal standpoint. And Janis talked a lot about some of those reporting requirements that are coming down the pike, especially for the public companies. But what are your customers expecting you to be? What are your employees expecting you to be? How are you going to recruit new people? So there's this concept of mandatory boundaries and also voluntary boundaries, right? You have to kind of define what you want to be as an organization, how you want to position yourself, and how you want to be perceived in the marketplace for all those various stakeholders that are out there. So just as we would do in enterprise risk management, we kind of define those strategies, and then we need to think about risks. What are the impediments or possible impediments to achieving those strategies to obtain the compliance that's required around the legal and regulatory requirements? And how are you going to go back to your board of directors or your governing bodies and stakeholders and report out to them that you're in line with your own expectations around what you've committed to the market and how you're achieving all those goals that you set out and so on. So it has to be managed from the top down. So it's very much a tone at the top kind of thing that's driven. But as you can see from this sort of a pyramid motif here, it kind of takes you down what we call the 3 lines of defense. I look at things from an internal audit perspective. That's the bottom line. That's line 3. But it starts with management. It really starts with the board and the governing bodies working down through management. And then you probably have some legal teams and compliance teams that may have a role in all of this. But kind of working down through those layers, it's about, what is that strategy? How you identify risks to may impede you from achieving that strategy? What is that appetite, and how do you kind of monitor yourself? Are you staying within the boundaries that you set for the organization, either because they're required or because they're voluntary ones that you want to achieve? And so then you have to have controls, just like any other risks in an organization. You need to define controls to manage those risks and make sure that risks are being mitigated. And that's going to vary depending on what the risks are. But a lot of it will get back to things like the integrity of the data, which is going to drive reporting and that sort of thing. Cybersecurity controls, all of that is going to come into play here. So, it's very important to have this kind of framework and this structure in place. And really, at the end of the day, you've got to have that alignment of roles and responsibilities and make sure that people have clear accountability for what they're responsible for within this risk management framework. So very important to have some structure around this. And of course, there's different ways to tackle it and there's different risks for different organizations, but the key is to really understand your risks and what's relevant for you as an organization, be it whether you're a payer, provider, or life science, and what does your extended universe look like in terms of your supply chain. And Jeff will talk more about that and those types of things as well. So why don't we go on to the next slide? Okay, so whenever there's risk, we also have to think about some of the possibilities of ethical lapses or fraud and that sort of thing. And many of you may have heard of the fraud triangle, but the same principles would also apply here, just as we were talking about more broadly enterprise risk. But in terms of what are some of the things that you need to think about with regard to ethics and fraud, there's basically 3 things in the fraud triangle that kind of drive higher probability of fraud or ethical lapses, and it gets down to motivation. What kind of pressure and motivation are people feeling to take certain actions? How could they possibly rationalize or justify an action that might be untoward or representative of a fraudulent activity or maybe an ethical lapse and that sort of thing. And then what are the opportunities that people have to perpetrate those actions that may be less desirable from a fraud standpoint or ethical lapses? So here I show you an example of one of the pressures or motivations that is out there to meet, in this case, greenhouse gas emissions. Maybe the organization has told the street or their stakeholders they're going to be at a certain level of emissions at a certain time. That puts a lot of pressure on people, right? And so then, how are people going to meet those targets? And so targets that are set by an organization really need to be reasonable and achievable. And then, once those pressures are there, it is possible that people could rationalize some kind of fraudulent reporting or less than full integrity, let's say, because of politics. I mean, there's an element out there that says, hey, this is all just about being woke, right? And they don't take it seriously. So how is that really being tackled within the organization? How do you kind of make sure that you mitigate those types of risks? And of course, we do have still lack of regulatory clarity, so people can kind of brush things off potentially and say, I'm doing the best I can, the rules aren't clear, and move on, right? And loose interpretation of what really needs to be provided and reported out, acceptance, or maybe there's tolerance of fudge factors in data and that sort of thing. And it kind of gets back to understanding where could you have some wiggle room and how tight do those controls need to be to really address those types of risks and that sort of thing. And then, of course, when you have pressure to potentially commit fraud and you can rationalize it, the other thing is there an opportunity for someone to actually do it, right? And the poorer the governance and the oversight, the weaker the internal controls, the lack of clarity around policies and procedures and the way that operations are handled gives people more opportunity to commit a fraud or just not be ethical in their behavior. And so the one area that we can control the most is reducing this opportunity. That's the one that we can manage the most. Again, targets, we can set those to be reasonable and achievable. We'll train people, but we really need to make sure we have good controls to reduce opportunities for risk in fraud and ethical lapse areas. So I think the keys here are training, transparency, alignment of roles and expectations, kind of going back to the earlier slide with the triangle, getting that framework in place, and really making sure that there's clear accountability across the organization for what people are responsible for doing, what is their role in all of this ESG, risk mitigation activity and reporting, and making sure that it's very clear for them how that will work. And of course, it does get extended out to the broader organization and the supply chain and all of that. And you have to have good policies around third-party risk management and vendor risk management. And Jeff is going to take us forward a little bit more to talk about the supply chain area.
Sorry, just real quickly, I wanted to, by the magic of Yolanda Wilson, who's really supported us, she was able to create this polling question last minute while we were talking. So you guys, could you just fill this out so that we can give you this feedback immediately? Is where are you in your ESG journey? Not started with planning to do internally, not started and need help, started and doing internally, started and using outside help. Thank you, Yolanda.
While you fill it out this, I think that because in the interest of time, we'll have Jeff begin talking to us a little bit more about how ESG is transforming supply chain risk management. Jeff, go ahead and begin the conversation while we do the polling so that we can benefit from the time.
Thank you, Augie. Definitely do that. So as we've discussed, ESG is a business critical element for many organizations. So investors reward it, customers demand it, employees desire it. So for supply chain, ESG may add risks and cost. So we have to undertake those activities after we understand the potential impacts. So let's start by framing up ESG and what's happening in the supply chain world. First of all, we talked a bit earlier about supplier diversity. So supplier diversity for many organizations started in the 90s and has evolved over the last 30 years to kind of the point that we're at today. We also saw Dodd-Frank come in about 2010. So we saw a focus on conflict minerals within our supply chains. We saw a focus on labor within our supply chain. And more recently, we're seeing a heavy focus on the environmental concerns. So waste management and diversion, water conservation and protection, deforestation, and ultimately the greenhouse gas management activities. So we'll talk more about GHG in a minute, but to get back into the supply chain world, the pandemic exposed a lot of risks and holes that supply chains have. Most organizations are working right now to enhance their supply chains and to add resilience into those. So this is the perfect time for us to talk about ESG and add ESG into that mix as well. There's a lot of activity underway. Let's make sure that we're accounting for all of the things that we want to be able to do in the future. So again, good opportunity for us to be able to do that. As part of the activities and kind of reevaluating supply chain, we're taking a deep dive into risk mitigation approaches. And then we're also working to create some level of redundancy, as we said. We're working to optimize inventory, gain better visibility into supply chain movements. And for manufacturers, they're going through an analysis right now of nearshoring versus onshoring versus kind of the current offshoring model, trying to figure out how do we effectively manage risk, how do we become more responsive to customer needs, and how do we ensure that we have continuity of supply and control going forward. So there's a lot of moving parts out there that could impact ESG. Generally speaking, implementing ESG initiatives will increase, as we said, will increase some of our costs and risks, and that must be managed. So the impacts, so if we take a step, if we take a step back, what's driven us to this point? We have worked diligently to try and reduce our cost in the supply chain world. So we've driven our prices down. We've moved to products that were readily available, that were easier for us to get, easier for us to manipulate. So we've been able to bring prices down, but we've done that at the detriment of the environment. So now we're looking at changing that model, going to a situation that is more environmentally friendly. So we're going to see an increase in cost. The other thing that's going to happen is as we do that, the environmentally friendly solutions will evolve. So their costs will come down over time, but as we initiate these, we will see some impacts there. So we've got to manage that and make sure that they account or that they work within our overall strategic objectives. If we look at one of the organizations that we're working with, they have a desire to eliminate plastics, which is great. They've been using plastics for years, especially in the container side of things. The alternative that they're looking to move to is in the glass space. So right now, there are constraints around the glass availability and glass manufacturing. So it's creating challenges and risks in their ability to gain the containers that they need. So there's an increase in capacity coming in California. There's a new plant that's coming online in another year in Mexico to be able to offset the demand for glass containers. So this company has elected to defer the initiative or to delay the timing of the initiative so that it coincides with the increased capacity associated with glass manufacturing, as the cost would have been substantial for them to move and to try and buy into the market with the constraints where they were. So one of the other things that we got out there that we have to keep in mind is that regulations are moving quickly. So for organizations right now, and Janis talked about it a minute ago, there's in Europe, there's a lot of regulations that are coming through right now. There are in the US, we obviously have the proposal that's out by the SEC right now that is looking at supply chains and potentially having to report on supply chain impacts. So those things are coming through. But the other thing that's happening is the implementation timelines are moving much more quickly. So we in supply chain are actively looking at the regulations that are out there, trying to make sure that we understand when those impacts are going to occur, when they're going to hit us, and what that's going to look like. Now, if we deep dive into some of the supply chain specific areas, one of the things that we talked about was redundancy. So, as we look at building out alternatives to our current products or current supply base, we can easily add ESG into that mix, and we can start working with suppliers to try and understand what the alternatives are that are better for the environment, and ensure that we include that in our selection process. The visibility into where those alternatives are and what we can do to improve the environment is also something that we can do early on in this process. So with that, I'll jump over real quick to the greenhouse gas, and we'll talk on that just to the interest of time. So if you want to jump to the next page. So the greenhouse gas protocol, for those of you that may not be aware, has broken this down into 3 scopes. We have scope 1, which is really your internal operations and the greenhouse gases associated with your internal operations. Scope 2 is associated with electricity, the electricity that we generate, use internally. And then scope 3 is really external or third-party impacts. So we've listed kind of the 15 elements within the scope 3 off to the right side here. The ones highlighted are ones that really are in the supply chain space. The other ones are third parties, but not really within the traditional realm of supply chain. So why is this important to us? Well, governments are now focusing on greenhouse gas. According to healthaffairs.org, somewhere between 70 and 90, depending on what discipline in the healthcare space you're in, somewhere between 70 and 90% of your greenhouse gas are originated through scope 3. So your core operations really are a relatively small component of your overall carbon footprint. So there's a real focus on greenhouse gas. Read a couple of articles as of late that says, hey, the SEC's focused on this for public companies, but we're also hearing rumblings that the government may look at this for other companies that are receive special consideration, whether that be tax consideration or are involved with other government agencies like Medicare. So this is one of those things that there's a lot of discussion right now about how do we get in organizations to focus on this. And there are, I think that it's going to continue to be a major topic for us as we go forward. So whether that's driving and the way that we transport product, whether that's the packaging that we use, whether that's the energy consumption that we use in trying to produce our products, make them, or in this case, it even gets back into employees and how far do employees commute to work, and travel cost. It also gets into anything that our franchises or any associated businesses are into. So from a scope 3 standpoint, the greenhouse gases are going to be something that we're going to have to continue to monitor.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much for that really in-depth, insight into the supply chain and the greenhouse part of this ESG program. We now open for more questions. While that's going through, we can summarize that ESG has come to stay and is going to really change the landscape of the way businesses conduct themselves going forward. It's as Ian talked about and Janis iterated and Jeff have all iterated in the webinar. This is the thing of the future, and for it is incumbent on businesses, healthcare companies, healthcare organizations to build these frameworks into their business operations in a way that aligns with their organization's strategy, and therefore they're able to measure it, able to report on it, able to use it to make business decisions going forward. That is the really core nature of ESG. With that said, Kenan, let's go through the poll question number 4.
So this is a response that we got for, you can see there's over half of you started and doing it internally, right? About 20% starting and using outside help, and the remaining 20% not started at all. So just to kind of give you a temperature of what's going on out there, just in our little microcosm of people here.
Thank you, Kenan. Do we have any additional questions, Kenan, from the webinar itself so far?
No, I think most of them have been, I think they can be answered directly here. There's one question is, will RGP provide links to regulatory requirements for ESG with any handouts? So we will distribute this deck, and we'll add some incremental information in here that sounds like that we can share with you with some of the requirements that we have. So yes, those of you in attendance, when we send out this deck to you, you'll get some supplemental information.
I think this may be concluding our webinar. Unless Keenan, you have other things to add to it, we can return about 4 more valuable minutes back to our participants, and hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Keenan, take it from here.
Yeah, and if you have any questions, or partner@rgphealthcare.com is further questions, but thank you for your attendance, and everyone have a great rest of your day.